Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, I rise in support of the 42,000 men and women of the United States Coast Guard, the vital public safety, humanitarian, and national defense missions they perform, and this House's passage yesterday of the Coast Guard Reauthorization Act of 2019. Coast Guard members are the first responders of America's oceans, waterways, and coastlines, conducting varied missions, often at a moment's notice, including search and rescue, securing our nation's ports and waterways, and conducting law enforcement operations. In my district in New Hampshire, we've been home to the Coast Guard since its founding, and the Granite State has relied on its work to keep us safe and strong for generations. Last month, I had the privilege of meeting with the crew of the Coast Guard cutter Tahoma at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. As I met officers and crew members and toured their vessel, I was struck by the critical nature of their missions and the challenges they encounter in executing them. Cutters like Tahoma patrol international waters and interdict drugs coming to America's shores. Their work saves lives and make our communities safer. The Coast Guard has been doing this work despite being chronically underfunded and under-resourced. The Coast Guard faces cartels and smugglers with staggering resources and advanced technology, and studies show that only 20 to 30% of the illegal drugs coming to our shores are interdicted. According to leaders of the Coast Guard, the most significant factor in its inability to meet drug interdiction targets has been insufficient inventory of vessels and aircraft to support operations. At a time when our nation is facing a profound crisis of addiction, we can and must do more to ensure that the Coast Guard is fully funded and has the resources it needs to keep our country safe. That's why yesterday's action to pass the Coast Guard Reauthorization Act in a bipartisan way was so critical. This act supports the Coast Guard for the next 2 years, with more than $11 billion in discretionary funding each fiscal year, allowing them to address a backlog created by previous cuts. An important bill I introduced was also included, the Fair and Equal Treatment of Women in the Coast Guard Act. This seeks to increase recruitment and retention of women in the U.S. Coast Guard and improve gender diversity in this branch of the armed forces. This comes in response to a study commissioned by the Coast Guard that identified barriers to attracting, recruiting, and retaining women and recommended ways to improve gender diversity in the service. It's one important step to ensure that the Coast Guard can continue to attract our nation's best and brightest. When we talk about keeping this nation safe, let's remember the incredible work performed by our Coast Guard close to home and around the globe. Let's show the Coast Guard members that Congress has their backs, and let's continue to work collaboratively to ensure the Coast Guard has the proper support and policies in place to carry out its missions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.